August 14, 2005. A Boeing 737 flies on autopilot toward Athens with 121 people on board. But something is terribly wrong. The pilots aren't responding to radio calls. Fighter jets scramble to intercept, and what they see through the cockpit window will haunt them forever. The pilots are slumped over, unconscious. The passengers? Already dead. For 2.5 hours, a ghost plane flies across Greek airspace until it runs out of fuel and crashes into a mountain. Everyone dies. This is the nightmare of Helios Airways Flight 522. Welcome to Black Box Secrets. I'm your host, and today we're investigating one of the most disturbing aviation disasters in history. This isn't a story about terrorism or mechanical failure. This is about how a simple mistake, a misunderstood warning, and a series of small errors created a flying tomb. What you're about to hear will change the way you think about aviation safety forever. Make sure you hit subscribe and turn on notifications because we uncover the darkest secrets in aviation history every week. It was a beautiful summer morning in Larnaca, Cyprus. Helios Airways Flight 522, a Boeing 737-300, sat on the tarmac preparing for a routine flight to Prague with a stopover in Athens. The aircraft had just undergone maintenance the night before. Ground engineers had been troubleshooting a door seal warning and had switched the pressurization system to manual for testing. This detail would become critically important. At 9:07 a.m. local time, Flight 522 pushed back from the gate with 115 passengers and 6 crew members on board. Captain Hans-Jürgen Merten, a German pilot with over 16,000 flight hours, was at the controls. First Officer Pampos Charalambous, a Cypriot pilot, sat beside him. Behind them, flight attendant Andreas Prodromou, who also held a commercial pilot license, prepared the cabin for departure. At 9:07 a.m., the Boeing 737 lifted off from Larnaca International Airport, climbing into the clear Mediterranean sky. Everything seemed normal. The flight was scheduled to take just under 2 hours to Athens, then continue to Prague. Families, tourists, and business travelers settled in for what should have been an uneventful journey. But something was already going catastrophically wrong. As the aircraft climbed through 12,000 feet, a warning horn began blaring in the cockpit. Captain Merten and First Officer Charalambous heard the sound but tragically misidentified it. They believed it was the takeoff configuration warning, indicating the aircraft wasn't properly configured for takeoff. But they had already taken off. They were already in the air. This made no sense. What they didn't realize was that the horn was actually the cabin altitude warning. The pressurization system was still in manual mode from a maintenance work the night before, and nobody had switched it back to automatic. As the plane climbed higher, the cabin wasn't pressurizing. The air was getting thinner and thinner, and everyone on board was slowly suffocating. At 9:20 a.m., just 13 minutes into the flight, Helios Operations received a text message from the captain, takeoff configuration warning. He was still trying to diagnose what he thought was a configuration problem. But it wasn't. His brain was already being starved of oxygen. He was experiencing hypoxia, a condition where lack of oxygen impairs judgment, causes confusion, and eventually leads to unconsciousness. Hypoxia is insidious. You don't realize it's happening. You feel fine, maybe a little lightheaded, maybe slightly euphoric. Your thinking becomes fuzzy. You make irrational decisions. You can't recognize the problem because the very organ you need to recognize the problem, your brain, is shutting down. At 9:23 a.m., Athens Air Traffic Control tried to contact Flight 522 as it entered Greek airspace. No response. They tried again. Silence. Again. Nothing. The Boeing 737 continued flying on autopilot, climbing to its cruising altitude of 34,000 feet, while everyone inside slowly lost consciousness. By 9:30 a.m., everyone on board Helios Flight 522 was unconscious or dead. The pilots slumped in their seats. Passengers sat frozen in their positions, some with oxygen masks dangling uselessly in front of them. The emergency oxygen masks had deployed automatically when cabin pressure dropped, but they only provide oxygen for 12 to 15 minutes. After that, nothing. The aircraft became a tomb, flying on autopilot through the Greek sky. Athens Air Traffic Control became increasingly concerned. They contacted other aircraft in the area, asking them to try establishing radio contact with Flight 522. Nothing worked. At 10:40 a.m., nearly 90 minutes into the flight, Greek Air Force F-16 fighter jets were scrambled to intercept the Boeing 737. What the fighter pilots saw will haunt them for the rest of their lives. As they pulled alongside the cockpit at 34,000 feet, they could see directly through the windows. Captain Merton was slumped over the controls, completely motionless. First Officer Charalambous appeared to be in his seat, but showed no signs of movement. The oxygen masks in the cabin were deployed and hanging down, but nobody was moving. One fighter pilot later described it as looking at a flying coffin. But then, something shocking happened. At 11:49 a.m., more than 2.5 hours into the flight, a figure appeared in the cockpit. Someone was moving. The fighter pilots watched in disbelief as a man in flight attendant uniform entered the cockpit and appeared to be trying to take control of the aircraft. It was Andreas Prodromou, the flight attendant who held a commercial pilot license. Somehow, impossibly, he had remained conscious longer than everyone else. Perhaps he was younger and stronger. Perhaps he was closer to a better oxygen source. Perhaps he was just lucky. But he had survived the hypoxia longer than the trained pilots. Andreas was trying to save the plane. The fighter pilots watched as he struggled with the controls, desperately trying to understand what had happened and how to fix it. He waved at the F-16s. He was alive. There was still hope. But it was far too late. The Boeing 737 had been flying for over 3 hours. The fuel was exhausted. At 11:59 a.m., the left engine flamed out. 6 minutes later, at 12:05 p.m., the right engine quit. The aircraft, with no power and a flight attendant desperately trying to control it, began its final descent. At 12:04 p.m., Helios Airways Flight 522 crashed into a mountain near Gramatiko, Greece, about 40 kilometers north of Athens. The impact was catastrophic. The aircraft disintegrated on contact, scattering wreckage across the hillside. All 121 people on board were killed instantly, though most had likely died from hypoxia long before the crash. Emergency responders arrived to find a scene of total devastation. Bodies were scattered across the rocky terrain. The aircraft was in thousands of pieces. But the most disturbing discovery was the condition of the victims. Medical examiners determined that most passengers and all crew members had died from hypoxia well before impact. They had been dead for hours while the plane flew on. Andreas Prodromou's body was found in the cockpit. He had fought until the very end, trying to save everyone, knowing it was hopeless. His bravery was remarkable. His tragedy was unbearable. The investigation into Helios Airways Flight 522 revealed a catastrophic chain of errors, each one seemingly small, but together creating an unsurvivable situation. Mistake 1. The pressurization switch during maintenance the night before. Ground engineers had switched the pressurization system from automatic to manual to test the door seal. This was normal procedure. But when the work was completed, nobody switched it back to automatic. The logbook wasn't properly annotated. The oversight went unnoticed. Mistake 2. Misidentifying the warning. When the cabin altitude warning horn sounded in the cockpit, the pilots misidentified it as a takeoff configuration warning. In Boeing 737s, the same horn is used for multiple warnings, distinguished only by when it sounds during flight. The pilots were already suffering from early-stage hypoxia, which impaired their judgment. They couldn't think clearly enough to correctly diagnose the problem. Mistake 3. Lack of hypoxia training. The pilots had received training on hypoxia, but it was minimal. They didn't recognize the symptoms in themselves. Hypoxia makes you feel euphoric, confident, and unaware that anything is wrong. It's called the silent killer because you can't detect it until it's too late. Mistake 4. Emergency oxygen. The cockpit had emergency oxygen available with a simple pull and turn. But the pilots never used it. By the time they might have realized they needed it, they were already too impaired to think clearly. Their brains were shutting down. Mistake 5. Maintenance oversight. Helios Airways had a history of maintenance issues and safety violations. The company culture didn't prioritize safety checks. The pressurization switch should have been caught during pre-flight checks. It wasn't. The Greek Air Accident Investigation and Aviation Safety Board concluded that the primary cause was the non-recognition that the cabin pressurization mode selector was in the man position during the performance of the before start checklist and the subsequent failure to identify the true nature of the problem. In other words, human error. A series of small, preventable mistakes that cascaded into catastrophe. Behind the statistics and the technical analysis were 121 real people. Families going on vacation. Business travelers heading to meetings. A young couple on their honeymoon. Children excited for their first plane trip. flight attendants, and pilots just doing their jobs. Among the victims were entire families wiped out in an instant. Children who would never grow up. Parents who would never see their children again. The crash devastated communities in Cyprus, Greece, and across Europe. Andreas Prodromou became a tragic hero. His family later described him as someone who would never give up, who would fight to the end. And he did. Alone in that cockpit, with everyone around him dead, knowing the plane was doomed, he still tried to save them. His final moments must have been terrifying beyond imagination. The Helios Airways disaster led to significant changes in aviation safety. Boeing issued new procedures for pressurization checks. Airlines implemented more rigorous pre-flight checklist protocols. Hypoxia training became more comprehensive and realistic, with pilots now experiencing simulated hypoxia in altitude chambers so they can recognize the symptoms in themselves. The pressurization warning systems were also scrutinized. Using the same horn for multiple warnings was identified as a design flaw. Modern aircraft have more distinct and unambiguous warning systems. Helios Airways, already struggling financially, never recovered from the disaster. The airline ceased operations in 2006, less than a year after the crash. Several executives and engineers faced criminal charges, though most were eventually acquitted or received suspended sentences. The Helios Airways tragedy teaches us several critical lessons about aviation safety. First, checklists exist for a reason. Pre-flight checklists are designed to catch exactly these kinds of errors. But they only work if they're followed carefully, completely, and without shortcuts. Second, hypoxia is a silent killer. You cannot trust yourself to recognize hypoxia. You need external systems, training, and procedures to protect you from something your own brain cannot detect. Third, safety culture matters. Airlines that cut corners, rush maintenance, or prioritize schedule over safety create the conditions for disasters. Helios Airways had warning signs of safety problems long before Flight 522. Fourth, small errors cascade. No single mistake caused this crash. It was a chain reaction of small failures, each one building on the last, until the situation became unsurvivable. Today, the crash site at Grammatico remains a memorial to the 121 victims. Families still visit, leaving flowers and photographs, remembering loved ones who boarded a plane one sunny morning and never came home. Every commercial pilot now receives enhanced hypoxia training. Every maintenance crew knows to verify pressurization settings. Every Boeing 737 has clearer warning systems. These changes came too late for Flight 522, but they've prevented future tragedies. The ghost flight of Helios Airways is a reminder that aviation safety is never guaranteed. It must be earned through vigilance, training, and an unwavering commitment to proper procedures. One small mistake, one skipped checklist item, one misunderstood warning can transform a routine flight into a nightmare. What haunts you most about this story? The slow realization that something was wrong? Andreas Prodromou's final moments in the cockpit? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if you want more deep dives into aviation disasters and the lessons we've learned from them, subscribe to Black Box Secrets and hit that notification bell. We're revealing the secrets hidden in aviation's darkest moments every single week. Thanks for watching, and remember, safety is never an accident.